I never imagined that love could feel like a battlefield in my own home. When I married Daniel, I believed in fairy tales, in us against the world, in the idea that family was supposed to protect you, not test you. But I learned the hard way that sometimes the people closest to you are the ones who hurt you the most. It started slowly, almost imperceptibly, the way a shadow creeps across a room when you're too busy looking elsewhere to notice. His mother, Judith, was charming. Sweet, polite, but there was an undertone I couldn't quite name. A subtle claim that Daniel's life, his loyalty, his very identity belonged to her. At first, I dismissed it as normal. Mothers are protective, right? But protectiveness turned into interference, advice into manipulation, concern into control. Every decision Daniel made, every plan we discussed, she had an opinion, not just an opinion, but an expectation, a requirement. And I foolishly thought love could withstand that quietly, behind closed doors. The first fight came over something small, a dinner invitation. Judith had called Daniel that afternoon, her voice honeyed and sharp at the same time, explaining why we should come to her house for Sunday lunch instead of keeping our own plans. Daniel hesitated, a flicker of unease in his eyes, and I felt it immediately. The hesitation wasn't about the dinner, it was about pleasing her, bending to her desires before thinking about me. I tried to laugh it off, told myself I was overreacting, that she was just being a loving mother. But the seed had been planted. That night, Daniel didn't apologize for agreeing. He barely even acknowledged my discomfort. The pattern began, small concessions, silent compromises, my needs slowly eroding. Like sand slipping through fingers I didn't even realize were open. It got worse, holidays became battlegrounds. Birthdays, anniversaries, simple weekend plans, all dictated, influenced, or outright controlled by Judith's opinions. Daniel seemed incapable of saying no. I remember one Christmas Eve in particular, when I had planned a quiet evening for just the two of us. He spent 3 hours on the phone with her, apologizing for imagined slights, negotiating schedules, seeking her approval. By the time he walked through the door, the magic of the evening was gone. I tried to express my hurt gently, but his defensiveness burned through the room. He claimed he was only being considerate, only trying to respect family. But what I felt wasn't consideration, it was submission. And it stung like betrayal, I realized, with cold clarity, that the person I married was not the man I thought I knew. He had a second loyalty, an unshakable bond to a mother who, knowingly or not, demanded my place. Years passed like this, each conflict layered over the last, until I stopped keeping track of the fights themselves. What I remember most vividly is the sense of constant erosion, the gradual disappearance of my voice. My choices, my agency. I stopped expressing opinions, stopped sharing plans, stopped hoping that Daniel would notice. I tried everything, gentle conversations, emotional appeals, reasoning. Nothing worked. Judith's presence was pervasive, her influence invisible but undeniable. And Daniel, he loved me, I think. But his love was never enough to push back, never strong enough to choose me over the woman who had given him life. That realization is heavier than any argument, more piercing than any insult. The person who promised to stand beside you will sometimes bow to someone else, and all you can do is watch. The breaking point didn't arrive with shouting or slamming doors. It arrived quietly, like the end of a story you've been reading too long, too distracted to notice the pages slipping away. I found out I was pregnant at first. I was elated, imagining a future where perhaps this tiny life could unite us, could create a bond that even Judith couldn't fracture. But the joy was short-lived. She called immediately, offering unsolicited advice, advice that carried an undertone of ownership, a reminder that she was the mother of Daniel, that she knew better. Daniel didn't correct her, didn't assert our space, didn't shield me. I felt my excitement drain, replaced by a profound loneliness. I realized that, in the most important moments, the person I counted on would side with his mother's vision over ours. I carried that weight through months of pregnancy, through doctor visits and nursery planning, silently mourning the partnership I had imagined but never fully had. And then came the moment that truly shattered everything. One evening, Daniel and I argued about a simple choice: where to deliver our baby. I wanted the hospital near our home, a place where we had established doctors, familiarity, and a sense of control. Judith insisted on another, miles away, under the pretense of quality and comfort. Daniel didn't negotiate, didn't compromise. He simply sided with her, saying gently, almost apologetically, that it was best for everyone. My world tilted. I was carrying our child, relying on him for safety and support. And yet he chose her, that night. I cried myself to sleep, not out of anger but disbelief. How could the man I loved, the father of my child, surrender so easily? How could my role, my voice, my life be secondary to a mother's preference? The betrayal was suffocating. Not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. A slow and steady suffocation that left scars deeper than words could convey. After the birth, the dynamic only worsened. Visits became invasions, decisions about feeding, sleeping, naming, every choice met with commentary, criticism, and subtle undermining. Daniel never intervened. He avoided conflict with her at all costs. And I became invisible in my own family. I remember holding my newborn, looking at Daniel and thinking, is this how it will always be? Will I always be the one sacrificing? Quiet, unseen, unheard, the realization was devastating. Love alone couldn't protect me. Marriage alone couldn't safeguard my place. And I understood, with unbearable clarity, that the woman who gave him life would always have the power to shape it over me. And I would pay the price in silence, loneliness, and compromise. I tried leaving. I thought separation would awaken him, make him see the truth, force him to choose. But he couldn't, even in my absence. He deferred, he apologized to her. He rationalized, he begged me to stay. Judith's presence loomed larger than my absence. The choice had been made long before vows, before love had a chance to mature. My role, though legally defined, emotionally real, was secondary. And I paid day after day, moment after moment, for a decision that had never been mine to influence. The months after our daughter was born were the hardest I had ever faced. I had imagined motherhood as a shared experience, a time when Daniel and I would navigate sleepless nights and first smiles together. Instead, I found myself alone in every decision. Every emotion, every fear. Judith was everywhere, quietly orchestrating everything, from the baby's schedule to the colors of the nursery. Her voice always calm, always certain, always subtly insisting that her way was the right way. And Daniel, as usual, didn't challenge her. He smiled politely, nodded, or sometimes even agreed without consulting me. It was as if my marriage had been hollowed out from the inside, leaving only the skeleton of a life we had once promised to build together. I began questioning myself. Was I overreacting? Was I being unreasonable to feel sidelined in my own home? But then I would see the tiny details, her rearranging the crib, instructing me on feeding schedules, suggesting that certain baby clothes were better than others, and I realized that it wasn't just a feeling. I wasn't paranoid. I was invisible in the family I had created with my husband. Every small choice I tried to make felt like a battle I couldn't win. And Daniel, the man I had trusted to be my partner, the one I believed would defend our family, remained silent, compliant, deferential to his mother at my expense. I started keeping a journal, writing down every moment, every conversation, every decision I hadn't been allowed to influence. At night, while the baby slept, I poured my thoughts onto paper, sometimes crying, sometimes shaking, sometimes furious. Writing became my only outlet, a place where I could reclaim some part of my voice. But it wasn't enough. The resentment inside me was growing, twisting into something I barely recognized. Love alone wasn't enough to shield me from the constant diminishment. Marriage vows couldn't overwrite decades of conditioning, the unspoken power a mother holds over her son. And I began to feel that no matter what I did, no matter how much I gave, I would always be second. The first real confrontation came unexpectedly. Daniel had promised to handle a simple task, registering our daughter for pediatric appointments. When I checked the schedule, I found that Judith had called the office, made the appointments herself, and had even spoken to the staff as if she were the mother. When I confronted Daniel, expecting an explanation, he said softly, almost apologetically, that it was easier this way. Mom just wanted to help. He said I didn't want to upset her. I felt a surge of something I couldn't name, hurt, anger, disbelief. He didn't see that I was the mother, that this was my role, my responsibility, my life. He saw only the need to avoid conflict with the woman who had raised him, the woman whose approval outweighed my presence in his family. And that's when I realized no amount of love, no amount of pleading could make him choose me over her. It didn't stop there. Over time, the tension infiltrated every aspect of my life. Holidays became exercises in endurance. Even small celebrations, like our daughter's first birthday, were orchestrated according to Judith's desires. Daniel deferred to her suggestions, sometimes in front of me, sometimes behind closed doors. I felt humiliated, powerless, and trapped. I began to withdraw, pretending not to care, even as resentment built silently into rage. I wanted to scream, to demand that my choices, my daughter, and I be respected, but fear of confrontation, of further fracturing the family, kept me silent, and Daniel, as always, remained unable to break free from his mother's influence, caught in the invisible web she had spun around him. At one point, I tried to enlist his empathy, telling him that I needed him to stand with me, to act as my partner. I explained that every time he deferred to Judith, it hurt me, made me feel like a stranger in my own home. He listened, eyes downcast, murmuring apologies, promising change, but the pattern didn't break. His promises were verbal shields, not real action, and each unfulfilled promise chipped away at my hope, leaving me raw and disillusioned. I began to understand a bitter truth. He loved me, but not enough to risk the comfort of his mother's approval. His love was constrained, filtered, conditional, and I was paying the price. I confided in a friend one night, someone I trusted implicitly. I explained how powerless I felt, how every choice I made was questioned, overridden, or quietly sabotaged. She looked at me, shocked, and said gently, "He's prioritizing his mother over you. You deserve someone who doesn't hesitate to choose you." Her words echoed in my mind, brutal and undeniable. I wanted to fight for my marriage, for my family, for the life I had envisioned. But every fiber of my being told me that Daniel's loyalty would always be divided, that his mother's influence would never allow me to feel fully secure. And slowly, painfully, I realized that sometimes love is not enough when the wrong person has more power than the one you love. The final breaking point came on a Sunday evening. I had planned a quiet dinner for just the three of us, Daniel, our daughter, and me. It was the first real night I had set aside since the baby was born, a night where I had hoped to reconnect, to reclaim some sense of intimacy and partnership. But Judith called that afternoon, insisting that Daniel and I join her for dinner instead. He hesitated, and I waited for him to say no, to assert that tonight belonged to our family. But he didn't. He said softly, "Mom wants us there, it's just dinner." And in that moment, I understood with crushing clarity that he would always choose her over me. I felt a weight settle into my chest, suffocating and relentless, and I knew something had to change, or I would lose myself entirely. That night, I made a decision I had been avoiding for years. I would stop pretending. I would stop hoping that love alone could protect me from the consequences of his divided loyalty. I started planning quietly how to reclaim my life, my space, my dignity. Because when the person who promised to stand beside you fails to choose you, the cost is paid in silence, sorrow, and slowly eroding self-worth. And I was no longer willing to pay that price. The confrontation came unexpectedly, not with fireworks or shouting, but with a quiet, devastating clarity. I had spent months simmering in frustration, feeling invisible in my own home, watching Daniel defer to Judith in every decision. Every tiny moment that night, after another subtle override of my wishes regarding our daughter's bedtime routine, something inside me snapped. I didn't yell. I didn't storm out. I simply sat him down, my hands trembling, and I spoke. I spoke not with anger, but with the weight of years of erosion, the pain of being silenced, the ache of watching my husband choose his mother over me. "Daniel," I said, "I cannot continue like this. I feel like I don't exist in this family. Every decision, every choice, everything we do is filtered through her. You stand by her instead of me. I need to know, am I wrong to feel invisible?" I waited, terrified, for his response. He looked at me with the soft, apologetic eyes I had once loved. I didn't realize," he murmured, voice low, almost pleading, but his words lacked conviction. The pause stretched, heavy with years of unspoken truths, and I realized that he had known all along, had always known, and had chosen inaction. I tried to explain the depth of my despair, the loneliness of navigating our life under her shadow, but each word seemed to dissolve into the air between us. He nodded, murmured apologies, and for a fleeting moment, I thought maybe he would understand. But I had learned by then that words without action were meaningless. The next day, the consequences of that confrontation began to manifest. Judith called, her voice saccharine, asking why we hadn't been to dinner the night before. Daniel, flustered, answered meekly, saying that I had insisted we stay home. His tone was careful, measured, as if he were negotiating a delicate truce. I realized with a sinking heart that even our confrontation had been filtered through her influence. His first instinct was not to stand with me, not to protect our home, but to placate his mother. I felt a deep, hollowing despair. Love, I realized, is not always enough. Loyalty, trust, and protection are the pillars of a marriage, and Daniel had abandoned them at the altar of maternal approval. Days turned into weeks, and the pattern persisted. Each decision, each small conflict, became a battleground where I was forced to either submit or fight endlessly. I tried compromise, reasoning, quiet negotiation, but every attempt met the same outcome. Judith's influence prevailed, and Daniel stepped aside. I began to notice the toll it took on my own spirit. I was exhausted, drained, resentful, and increasingly withdrawn. The sense of partnership I had imagined in marriage was gone. My husband was present in body, but absent in the ways that mattered. And the worst part was knowing that this was not temporary, that this was who he was, conditioned, loyal to his mother above all else. One evening, I found myself standing in the nursery, our daughter asleep in the crib, and I realized that I could no longer remain silent. The sacrifices I had made, the patience I had endured, the countless times I had swallowed my hurt, it had to end. I needed him to choose, not for me, not even for our daughter, but for the truth of our marriage. I explained that every time he deferred to his mother, he was eroding our bond, teaching our child that her mother's voice didn't matter in her own home. I could see the shame flicker in his eyes, but it was fleeting, and I understood something devastating. Shame without action is worthless. He was aware of the damage, but he was incapable of breaking free. The revelation hit me fully one night when I overheard a conversation between them. I had gone upstairs to retrieve a blanket, and I caught fragments of their voices through the thin walls. Judith, speaking in that same soft, commanding tone, reminded him of all the ways I wasn't doing things right, and subtly suggested she would guide the baby's care herself. Daniel responded with what I can only describe as a compliance that made my chest ache. He didn't defend me, he didn't assert our partnership. He simply agreed, quietly, submissively, as if her judgment carried more weight than my presence in my own life. In that moment, a wave of grief and anger washed over me. I understood clearly that this was not about love. This was about control, and I was powerless in the face of it. I began distancing myself emotionally, retreating into the parts of my life Judith couldn't touch: my work, my writing, my own private spaces. I stopped asking for input from Daniel, stopped sharing decisions, stopped expecting him to stand with me. I learned to create boundaries, invisible yet rigid, around my own heart. And yet, even with these boundaries, the pain persisted. It lingered in small moments. The way he would glance at her texts, the way his tone shifted when speaking about family events, the way our daughter's milestones were filtered through her lens rather than ours. I realized that I was living in a home I could not claim, under a husband who could not choose me fully, and beside a mother-in-law whose presence was constant, insidious, and absolute. The breaking point arrived quietly, almost insignificantly, as many of these moments do. One afternoon, Daniel suggested we visit Judith together to make her happy, despite my protests that we needed time alone as a family. The casualness with which he prioritized her happiness over mine, over the family we were meant to build, shattered me. I saw then that no amount of pleading, of reasoning, of showing love would change the dynamic. His choice had been made years ago, long before I realized it, and I had been paying the price ever since. That evening, I finally understood the depth of my loss. Love, care, and devotion were not enough when the person who promised to protect you surrendered to another's influence. I sat alone in the dark, our daughter asleep beside me, and I mourned not just the husband I thought I had married, but the family I thought we could create together. Judith had won not through malice alone, but through the slow, deliberate shaping of a son who could not choose against her. And I, who had entered that marriage with hope and trust, was left to gather the fragments of my dignity, my voice, and my sense of self, wondering if the man I loved could ever be truly mine. I knew something had to change. I could no longer live in a house where my husband's loyalty was divided, where my voice, my choices, and even my child's life were constantly mediated by another woman. The breaking point was clear. and I realized that action, not words, would determine the future of our family. I sat Daniel down one evening, exhaustion etched into every line of my face, and I spoke with a finality I had never found before. I cannot continue like this, I said quietly, almost painfully. I cannot watch you surrender our life to your mother anymore. Something has to give because I cannot live in this shadow. I could see him shrink in the chair across from me, his eyes wide, a mixture of fear, confusion, and the first glimmer of recognition of the damage that had been done. For the first time, I laid bare the depth of my hurt. I explained how years of subtle manipulation, of deferral to his mother's wishes, had left me invisible, silenced, and resentful. I told him how it affected my relationship with our daughter, how it eroded the trust and intimacy that a marriage is supposed to provide. He listened quietly, nodding occasionally, but there was a hesitation in him, a resistance born not of defiance, but of years of conditioning. He had always believed that loyalty to his mother was a sacred, unassailable duty, and now he was forced to confront the consequences of that obedience. I told him that love alone was insufficient if it could not be paired with courage, with the willingness to protect and choose your partner, even when it meant displeasing someone else. The confrontation opened something raw and painful between us. Daniel admitted, reluctantly, that he had never realized how deeply his actions or inactions had hurt me. He said he had always believed that love was enough to keep the marriage intact, that deferring to his mother's wishes was simply being a good son. But in that admission lay the truth I had suspected for years. He had never fully understood what marriage required of him. And I realized that understanding, without genuine change, was meaningless. His words were empty if not followed by action. The final revelation came that night, after a long silence. He confessed that part of him feared his mother's disappointment more than he feared losing me. The words hit me like ice water. Love, I understood then with a piercing clarity, can coexist with fear. Fear can quietly destroy everything that love has built. Slowly and irreversibly, the man I loved had been trapped, not by malice, not by choice, but by an invisible cage forged from a mother's control and a son's inability to break free. And in that revelation lay both heartbreak and clarity. I could no longer depend on him to protect the family we had imagined. I made a choice that night, one born not of vengeance but of survival. I would reclaim my life, my dignity, and my role as a mother and partner. I began setting boundaries with Judith, firm and unflinching. No more unsolicited advice. No more decision making on our behalf. No more intrusion. Daniel resisted at first, unsure how to navigate the sudden assertiveness in the woman he had taken for granted. But I held steady, and slowly, he began to see the consequences of his past inaction. He witnessed the depth of my pain, the courage it took to speak, and finally, a flicker of accountability appeared in his eyes. It wasn't complete, not yet, but it was something I had been waiting for years to see. The process was neither quick nor easy. There were nights filled with tears, mornings filled with tension, days when I doubted whether I had the strength to continue. But each small victory, each instance where my voice was heard, each moment where a boundary was respected, reaffirmed that change was possible. Even if imperfect, our relationship began to shift subtly. Daniel started to assert himself, to challenge his mother's overreach, to recognize the life we were building as ours first. Not hers, the journey was painful, a series of small confrontations and incremental victories. But it marked a turning point. For the first time in years, I felt seen, recognized, and respected. And then came the day when everything changed completely. Judith called, her tone sharper than usual, questioning a decision about our daughter's schedule. Daniel, for the first time, did not defer. He stood quietly but firmly, expressing our choice, our agreement, and our boundaries. I watched him do it, disbelief and relief washing over me in equal measure. He had finally chosen us, chosen me, chosen the family we were creating. It was not a grand, cinematic victory, but it was the most profound moment of my life. Years of quiet suffering, fear, and despair had led to this instance of courage. And in that moment, I realized that love, when paired with assertiveness and accountability, could survive even the most insidious interference. The road ahead is not perfect. Our family is still learning how to navigate the presence of a mother who once held too much power. And Daniel is still learning how to balance loyalty with independence. But I have learned something essential. The cost of silence is far greater than the cost of confrontation. And courage, even when belated, is transformative. I have reclaimed my voice, my choices, and my role in this marriage. And in doing so, I have protected the life of our daughter from the shadow that once loomed over it. If there's one thing I want anyone reading this to take away, it's this: never underestimate the cost of choosing others over yourself. Never allow fear to dictate loyalty. And never forget that your voice matters, even in the face of generations of control. To all of you who have endured silent suffering, who have been invisible in your own homes, I promise you this: reclaiming yourself is possible, and it is worth every tear, every confrontation, and every moment of fear. If my story resonates with you, please like, share, and subscribe, and leave a comment about your own experiences. Your voice deserves to be heard, and your story matters as much as mine.